Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Story to Kill by Lynn Cahoon, narrated by C.S.E. Cooney. Chapter 1. When Thomas Wolfe said you can't go home again, Cat Latimer wondered if he knew he was full of crap. She stood at the turret window looking out on her backyard in Aspen Hills, Colorado. During her marriage, she'd made this circular room into her office. The wall-to-ceiling built-in bookshelves were now bare, waiting to be refilled with the rare and not-so-rare books she'd collected during her 2 years as an English professor over at Covington College. She brushed her fingers over the cool window glass, not quite believing she was back. "So you're just standing around, staring out the window? You realize we'll have guests arriving in less than 2 weeks." Shauna walked into the room and put her arm around Cat. "You aren't thinking about Michael, are you?" Shauna Mary Cloda had been her best friend since the minute Cat met the tiny, red-headed bartender at the local pub near the apartment she'd rented in Los Angeles. It hadn't been the best job, but Cat had jumped at the first teaching position that took her away from Aspen Hills. Into the frying pan, her mother would have said. But she didn't regret her years in California. She'd learned how to surf, or at least how not to drown. She hoped that skill would keep her above water now. "I love this office. I always wanted to write here. Not grade papers, not work on lesson plans. Just write the stories in my head." "Now you can. But first I need to talk to you about the breakfast menus. I've baked a few batches of different muffins and breads to try. Oh, and the handyman called back, and he'll be here first thing tomorrow morning." Shauna looked out the window. "You really lucked out on this deal. Good thing Michael was too busy dating all those co-eds to remarry or change his will." "Brutal. Good thing you're my friend." Cat picked up a notebook and a pen. "Let's go walk through the guest rooms on the second floor and make a list of what needs to be finished so the guy can get right to work." As she shut the door to the office, she thought about Shauna's words. Why hadn't Michael left the house and his estate to someone in the family? She vaguely remembered him talking about a cousin somewhere in eastern Washington. She sighed. There was no use trying to figure out what Michael had been thinking. The house was hers again. This time, she would make her own decisions. Aspen Hill's largest employer and claim to fame was Covington College. The small liberal arts school was located just a few blocks away from 700 Warm Springs, her new/old home. Cat made her way to the Abigail Smith building, home of the English department, and her former employer. Behind the front desk was a large trophy case with a lighted sealed section for the Covington English Department Cup. Each year, the professors voted on the student with the most potential to make a mark in his or her career. When Cat had been a professor, she'd taken the voting seriously, nominating several of her exceptional students. One, a budding poet, got shortlisted, but mostly she noticed the final nominations looked like a popularity contest rather than true talent. She squinted to see who had won the cup this year and paused. Sarah Lane. She pulled out the list Shauna had given her. Yep, it was the same. She had a cup winner attending her retreat. A student sat at the reception desk reading. She looked up as Cat stopped at the desk. "You need help?" She put her finger on the line to mark her place and waited for Cat's response. "I've got an appointment with Dean Vargas. Can I just go to his office?" Cat nodded down the hall. Some things never changed, especially the fact that the dean of the department always had the biggest office. "Whatever." The girl went back to her reading. Work-study jobs on campus tended to be more make-work positions, so Cat didn't blame the girl for being bored out of her skull. Cat knocked on the door and a muffled voice answered,
"Come in. It's not locked."
She peered around the door, making sure the man was alone. Michael wasn't the only professor with a history of enjoying time with the female students. "Dean Vargas, do you have a minute?"
"Well, if it isn't the prodigal daughter come home. So good to see you, Catherine."
Dean Vargas stood and stepped around his desk. He looked the same as he had when she'd put in her resignation letter 2 years ago. Hair gently graying, he stood tall and trim. She'd never been able to pinpoint his exact age, and several times when she was teaching the picture of Dorian Gray, Dean Vargas's image had come to mind.
"So, how are sales of that Tales of a Teenage Vampire book going?"
Cat thought of correcting him on the title, but knew he wouldn't remember anyway. "Very well. Thank you for asking. The book is getting great reviews from the major players." She pulled out a list of next week's retreat guests from her tote and handed it to him. "I'm glad we could settle on the contract terms for the retreat customers. My first group is arriving next week. These are the 5 people who will need library passes." Dean Vargas took the list and, without looking at it, set it in a tray on his desk.
"I'm happy we could be of assistance. I understand Professor Turner is doing a short presentation on the Hemingway papers as part of the retreat."
"He is. Hemingway is just such a large part of the American writer mystique. I'm sure all of my guests will enjoy his session." Cat looked around the office. On a side table, a pile of the university's latest literary journals sat on display. "I've loved the last few editions of The Cove. I miss working with the journal staff."
"The new professor we hired to replace you is enjoying the task just as much as you did."
He paused at the desk before returning to sit in his chair, choosing an appropriate look of concern or gravity for his facial expression.
"We were shocked to hear about Michael's passing. He was a vital part of this college. The economics department is finding it very hard to replace him with a candidate of his stature."
Cat didn't know the etiquette regarding accepting condolences about a divorced, deceased spouse, but she decided it didn't do anyone any good to be rude or point out the obvious. "Michael will be missed by many people." She wondered if Dean Vargas had guessed her husband's extracurricular activities had been the reason behind the split, but decided to take the high road anyway. She adjusted her tote. "Anyway, lots to do. Thank you again." Dean Vargas nodded and focused on his monitor.
"You are most welcome. However, in the future, there's no need for you to bring this over in person. Just drop the list in the mail. Good day, Catherine."
Dismissed from His Excellency's presence, she hurried out of the building, hoping not to meet anyone else from her past. Dean Vargas had been a jerk to work for back then, and he was still a jerk today. Hell, he probably was born a jerk. With that thought lifting her spirits, she strolled through the commons to the street. Walking back to the house, she soaked in the warm autumn sunlight. Indian summer, her mother would have called the warm October day. School had been in session for a few weeks, so students were hanging around the grounds as she walked by, enjoying the summer's last hurrah of warmth. A police car pulled up next to her. 2 short blasts of the siren made her jump and brought her back to reality. The passenger window eased down, and an officer leaned across toward her.
"You know, there's no loitering in town. I may have to arrest you."
"I'd like to see you explain that at the family reunion next summer." She squatted down by the car, her arms resting on the open window. "How are you, Uncle Pete? I was planning on stopping by the house as soon as I got settled."
"Old and crotchety, just like always. How are the house renovations going? You going to be up and ready for that group coming in next week?"
He took off his baseball cap and rubbed his head with his free hand.
"If you need me, I can come over and help this weekend. I'm knee-deep in paperwork from the college opening, but I could spare a few hours."
Cat shook her head. "You don't worry about it. Shauna has found a handyman who works at a reasonable rate." She checked her watch. In fact, he should be there right now. Her uncle frowned.
The only handyman around these parts is...
The radio in his car blared, and he paused, turning his attention to the dash. Chief, they need you over at campus security. Some kid brought his stash of pot. The dispatcher sounded like she was in another town, on the other side of the mountain, and in a well. Sounds like you're busy. I'll let you go. Cat tapped the car. You stop in for coffee and a treat some morning. I'd love for you to meet Shauna. Her uncle peered at her for a second before the radio blared again. Chief? He pulled out the microphone.
I heard you.
Putting it back on the holder, he smiled.
I'll drop by soon. We might have something to talk about.
Chief Pete Edmund gunned the engine in his black Dodge Charger and pulled away from the curb. Cat watched him as the car made its way up the road to the administration building. The guy gets weirder every year. She loved her uncle, but sometimes, like now, he could be cryptic about the silliest things. She returned to her stroll and was walking up the stone path to her front porch when someone barreled through the front door and down the porch steps, a sheet of plywood in large, rough hands. Jumping off the sidewalk to avoid being smashed by the wood or its carrier, she waited for the guy to slap the sheet on the sawhorses set up in the middle of her front lawn. This must be the repair person Shauna hired. Something about the guy and his short brown hair seemed familiar. In tighter than normal jeans and a faded t-shirt, at least from the back he was easy on the eyes. You need to watch where you're going with that, she muttered, and turned toward the front door. Her day had been filled with bulldozing men, but this was the first one who actually could have run her over. Kitty Cat, is that you? Crap. Cat stood frozen to the ground, not wanting to turn around. There was only one person who called her by that nickname. No one had dared since she beat up most of the 5th grade class and put them straight that she was not a feline. Seth Howard had just laughed when she'd wrestled him to the ground. When he'd flipped her over, trapping her instead, he'd whispered in her ear, "You'll always be Kitty Cat to me." Then he'd let her up and shrugged for the rest of the class to see. Slowly she turned around, banishing the memory from her mind and bringing herself back to the here and now. Seth? You're the handyman? He laughed that easy laugh she remembered from too many weekend trips with the gang, camping, fishing, and drinking around the campfire. He had been her first and last boyfriend before she met Michael. The two men couldn't have been more different. Seth was Colorado born and raised. He could fish, hunt, and build a small shack in the woods to live off the land. Michael preferred his fish gently poached and served with a little Riesling. Or had. I didn't realize you were back in town. He reached out and touched her brown hair, cut short into a pixie. You look good. I like the new do. She should have melted on the spot, but there was just enough ice left in her veins to cause her to nod, like one of those Hawaiian dolls Uncle Pete had on his old truck's dashboard. She licked her lips, suddenly feeling her mouth dry up like the Salt Lake Desert. She should start carrying bottled water when she walked. Yeah, that was the problem, her drinking habits. She gave in, trying not to be rude. Thanks, you look good yourself. You buy this? He nodded to the weathered blue Victorian behind her. Cat squirmed a little. Seth hadn't approved of her dating Michael, and when they got married in the little church on campus, he'd snuck in the back, standing in front of the closed doors, his hands crossed in front of him as the vows were read. Then he disappeared. A total Benjamin Braddock moment, only Seth hadn't said a word. This was the first time she'd seen him since her wedding day. Actually, Michael left it to me. She paused. He died earlier this year. Seth nodded and walked closer, putting a hand on her arm. I'm sorry to hear that, but weren't you divorced? So he had kept up on the gossip about her. For some reason this made her gut tighten just a bit. 3 years now. Believe me, I never thought he'd keep me in the will. I hadn't even talked to him since the day the papers were signed. He searched her face, looking for something, what, she didn't know. He lowered his voice when he responded. I am sorry. She wondered exactly what he was sorry about, but didn't want to ask. They'd gone their separate ways, and now she was back and single. That didn't mean that he was available. For all she knew, he had a wife and 6 kids stashed somewhere in the woods. She dropped her gaze to his hand still on her arm. His left hand, with no ring. He noticed her look, and dropped his arm back to his side. So, the house. Shauna tells me you're opening some kind of hotel? He took a step back, increasing the distance between them. Cat wanted to step forward, close the space back up. Hell, if she was honest with herself, she wanted to step into his arms, kiss him, and drag him up to her bedroom. But no ring didn't mean no attachments. She'd learned that early in her L.A. dating years. Besides, how cliché was it to fall back in bed with your high school love? She banished the thoughts of what they could be doing, and turned toward the house, so she wouldn't have to look into those dark brown eyes. Actually, I'm opening a writer's retreat. People come for a week. We feed them breakfast and a few dinners, and set up time for them in the college library and a couple seminars. But mostly they are on their own to write. She regarded him. He didn't seem bored with the conversation topic yet. I'm an author now. Seth nodded. Sounds about right. You always were good with stories. He nodded to the wood. You've got some flooring that needs to be replaced in most of the second-floor bedrooms. I should be able to get that done today, and I can paint tomorrow. She stared at him, wondering if there was something more to his comment about stories. Sounds good. Let me know if you need anything. Then she turned and ran into her house, up the 3 flights of stairs and into her office, shutting the door behind her. When she'd caught her breath, she stood at the end window and watched him work, willing him not to look up so she wouldn't get caught. A knock came at the door. Cat, you want some lunch? Shauna rarely came into the office if the door was closed, assuming Cat was writing, unless she was dropping off coffee or food. Which she should be doing rather than watch the way Seth's muscles rippled in the sun, especially after he surrendered to the heat and stripped off the t-shirt to the tank underneath. I'm not hungry right now, she called back. Well, she was hungry, just not for the soup and sandwich Shauna had prepared. Chapter 2. You knew. Cat watched as her uncle stirred 3 teaspoons of sugar into his coffee. He reached for a 4th time, but she moved the sugar bowl out of his reach. Uncle Pete sighed, then sipped his coffee, wincing at the bitterness that he couldn't possibly taste with all that sugar in the cup.
I'm not sure what you're talking about.
Really? You want to play dumb? She sipped her own coffee. Fine. Seth Howard. You knew he was the handyman Shauna had hired.
Guilty as charged. But in my defense, there is only one handyman in town, so it wasn't much of a leap.
Uncle Pete shrugged.
So, did he get you all ready for the arrivals today?
Seth had worked long hours every day since he'd started. Luckily, Cat had been able to hole up in her office for most of that time, and she'd even got a little bit of writing done. Her deadline was fast approaching, and she wasn't nearly as close to done as she wanted to be on the latest book. However, she hadn't been able to avoid running into him in the kitchen several times. Shauna had started teasing her when she'd grab coffee and disappear if Seth happened to be getting a drink, or worse, chatting with Shauna. The rooms are ready. I still want to remodel the attic into a library sitting area, but I'm sure Seth has other commitments. Or at least she hoped that was true. She needed time without worrying about running into him around the next corner all day long. Shauna set a basket of muffins on the table and joined them. Actually, he doesn't, so he wants to sit down with you on Monday and talk about what you want done upstairs. I said bookshelves, a couple built-in desks, and a window seat under that grand stained glass window in front. Well, then there's no need for me to talk to him. You seem to have it handled. Cat hadn't meant for the words to come out as bitter as they sounded. Shauna tore apart a banana nut muffin and buttered the insides, keeping her gaze on the food. I'm not playing in your backyard, Cat. I have no interest in the man, although he is fine to look at. I don't know what you're talking about. Cat grabbed a muffin and mirrored Shauna's actions. Shauna turned to Uncle Pete. Has she always been a big fat liar? He was busy with his own muffin.
Pretty much, especially when it came to that boy. You wouldn't believe the places I found them during their high school years. Windows in that Camaro of his were always steamed up by the time I'd see the car parked on some back road.
You know I'm right here, listening to all of this, right? Cat focused on a drop of melted butter that was just about to drip off the muffin. I'm not afraid of meeting with the man. I just have a lot of work to do, especially since we'll have guests coming in today. This was the opening session of the writer's retreat, and she'd planned to hold one a month for the first year. Then she'd reevaluate the venture. The next 3-month sessions were already starting to fill, and that was with little to no advertising. Writers wanted a place to get away from their daily lives and just write. But if the Warm Springs Writer's Retreat got any more popular, Cat would be the one needing a space to hide. You don't have to do anything except eat breakfast with the group and take them to the library to set up their passes, Shauna pointed out. I'm handling all the guest services stuff, like more towels and Wi-Fi access problems. That's why you hired me, right? To be the concierge, so you could still put in your word count during the retreat week? Well, that and your mad cooking skills. Cat took another muffin, smiling at her friend. I give up. What time am I supposed to meet with Seth? 2:00. I wanted you to be back from the library and have time to do your hair and makeup before he arrived. Shauna ducked as Cat threw the muffin at her. Seriously, you have to lighten up. I haven't had this much fun teasing you since you arrived in L.A. and thought you were drinking at a straight bar. I liked that bar. Everyone was very nice. Cat smiled. Besides, I wasn't looking to hook up. I just wanted a drink at the end of the day. That's why you go to a place with a good Irish name. O'Malley's was just down the street. Shauna examined the caught muffin, pulling it open for the steam to rise before she added butter. What about you, Pete? What's your poison?
Beer. Draft, if possible.
Uncle Pete laughed.
A small-town police chief doesn't get to sit in any kind of establishment like that for very long or very often before tongues start wagging. I kind of like my job, so I tend to only keep a 6-pack in the fridge.
Tell us your favorite brand, and we'll have a supply over here, too. That way you can say you were just visiting your niece. Cat sipped her coffee. This was nice. Quiet, peaceful Sunday morning chat with her 2 favorite people.
I appreciate the offer, but I'm just as good with a glass of sun tea these days as a beer.
Uncle Pete stood, adjusting the belt around his waist. He carried all the normal police gear, gun, handcuffs, nightstick, pepper spray. But Cat didn't think he'd used any of the tools for years. Aspen Hills tended to be pretty quiet. Whether that was because of the small-town atmosphere, or her uncle's even-handed reign over the enforcement of law for the last 20 years, she didn't know. However, she suspected it was the latter. Uncle Pete would be missed when he decided to retire.
Speaking of small-town gossip, I guess I better get going. You don't want your neighbors thinking something's wrong over here.
He looked at Shauna.
You mind if I take one of these for the road? They are twice as good as the ones they sell in the bakery down the street."
Shauna blushed and grabbed a to-go box. "Take 2. I'm making a couple more batches today, so when the guests arrive, they can have a treat." "Speaking of our guests, we need to make a plan for today." Cat pulled out a notebook and glanced through the arrival times of the 5 retreaters. "Looks like we'll have to make 2 airport runs." "I told you I'd handle the runs. You just need to be hanging out in the main living room from 6 to 9, so you can deal with any issues while I'm out." Shauna's lips curved into a grin. "You'll like it. You can talk your writer geek stuff and actually have someone who understands what you're saying." Uncle Pete chuckled and kissed Cat on the head.
"See you later, Pumpkin."
After he left, Cat pulled out her paper planner and went over the next week. "Still, I want to go over everything. I need the retreat to be a success. You know one of the guests is Tom Cook, a best-selling thriller author. I have no idea why he decided to come here. I read he owns an apartment in the Dakota where he writes. Maybe he wanted a change of scenery from NYC. Or maybe," Shauna's eyes widened, "he's setting his new book in Colorado. This might be a research trip for him." Cat nodded thoughtfully. "I hadn't considered that." She went back to her list. "The rest of the group is unpublished. We have 2 sisters writing romance, a graduate student from Covington who is working on her thesis, and a guy who just marked fiction on his questionnaire. Kind of a mixed bag, but maybe Tom will be willing to share his journey during one of the dinners. I'll have to pull him aside and ask." Shauna picked up her cup and refilled it at the pot. "These muffins aren't going to make themselves. I'm making a batch with pumpkin and one with cranberries." She started prepping her workstation with the ingredients for the recipes. Cat glanced over the weekly schedule they'd printed out for the guests and made some notes in her calendar to remind her to attend at least some of the events. And Seth on Monday. No good could come of his hanging around. She realized she hadn't asked Uncle Pete if Seth was married or even dating. She'd been so busy denying her attraction she'd missed the opportunity to be nosy. Now it would look like she was interested, even though she definitely was not. Okay, so the word was more like slightly, or even probably. Who was she kidding? She wanted the guy. Wanting isn't needing, she reminded herself. Her body surged in disagreement. She closed her calendar with a snap, refilled her coffee cup, and headed upstairs to work on her book. 2, maybe 3 hours of glorious nothing to do but write. And think about Seth. She turned on her computer and pulled out the file where she kept her working notes. A knock pulled her out of the story of Corey and her otherworldly friends. She loved making up the high school for the special, which could mean the kid was a shapeshifter, werewolf, or even a witch like Corey. Since her folks had never explained her special powers, Corey saw her new world differently. A feeling Cat could relate to, especially recently. Shauna peeked around the door. "Hey, I don't want to bother you, but you've been up here for hours. I have a potato soup on the stove with bread bowls in the oven warming. I figured some of the guests may be hungry when they arrive." Cat hit the save button and turned around. "Sorry, Corey's getting ready for the prom. Of course, she's not sure who she's attending with yet." "Oh, the growing pains of high school. I still can't believe you want to write about that time. I kissed the ground on the day I graduated and never looked back." Shauna leaned against the door, her jacket on and the keys to the SUV in her hand. "I guess I want to rewrite the ending. Although I have to admit for the most part I loved high school." Cat turned off the computer and stood and stretched, rubbing a spot on her left shoulder that always burned after a long writing session. "I suppose I should get ready to play the hostess. Do I have time for a shower?" "If you promise to eat first." Shauna checked her watch. See you in just over an hour. I checked the airline and the romance.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?